Okay, so this is going to be the second half of the review of the Maimer of the 7th of Shvat of the previous Rebbe when he came to visit Chicago in the book called Beaker Chicago, or Touching a City's Soul. And we're in the middle of reviewing. I'm going to share screen the review just so we can all look at it together. Okay, so everybody can see it, hopefully. And also people had it emailed to them last week, so you can look at it from that. If that's easier for you, you can look at it there. But if you want to see it, okay. So we were up to we've done the first 2 pages. I'm going to really quickly review the review so that we're just all caught up. And basically, as we said, every Hasidic discourse is based on a verse or a quote from the Talmud usually. And this one is trust in Hashem and do good, dwell in the land and be nourished by your faith. So we talked about the idea that the first half of the pasuk, trust in Hashem and do good, are instructions and a caution. A person should do this. And this refers to having bitachon, or trust in Hashem, as the pasuk says. And dwell in the land and be nourished by your faith are assurances. Those will be the results. If a person behaves in the way of the first half of the pasuk, they'll be the result of the second half. And this refers to Emunah. And then basically, we're not going to go through the whole document again. We did that last week, but we're just going to be reviewing the little bits enough to like jump into today's review, which is for Emunah, which is faith, to pervade all of one's faculties, one needs to nourish it. Otherwise, it remains a surrounding soul power, not something that necessarily permeates us. And we do this through the service of Torah mitzvahs with spiritual exertion, which means working to reveal the powers of the soul, like working to give our soul basically a voice, that we should hear the voice of our soul and use our soul powers, and physical exertion, which is weakening the physical grip of the body so it won't obscure godliness. In other words, basically working on the struggle of being a human being. Like that's how, just keep on working. Just keep on working to listen to the voice of our soul and not let the voice of our body, be the overpowering opinion, basically. And when we say the voice of our body, we also mean the voice of our ego, right? It's not just the physical body, but it's our physicality. And we are trying to conceptualize, understand, and bond with a godly concept until we can actually feel it and sense it. That's sort of like, this is the roadmap of the entire Maimer. This line here that the Rebbe says right at the beginning of the Maimer, this is really the roadmap of the entire Maimer, and everything else is going to be discussed basically based on this idea that this is what we're trying to do. So that was the first section, a review of the first section. The second section talks about Moshe Rabbeinu and how he was a great leader called a faithful shepherd, or the shepherd of faith. And in the words of the Zohar, Raya Mehemna, which means, it could be translated as either faithful shepherd or shepherd of faith, that he is a faithful shepherd, meaning that he is very trustworthy himself, but shepherd of faith means that he actually helps to shepherd the faith of the Jewish people and make it accessible to us. And then it talks about Moshe's greatness versus other tzaddikim. So we're going to skip over that. We did that last week, but just this is the next main idea. And then in the third section of the Maimer talks about the levels of the Jewish souls and the definition of das. So we talked about like Emunah, the importance of Emunah. We talked about Moshe Rabbeinu and his greatness, and now we're talking about ourselves, basically, our souls, and like how we actualize them. So how do we actualize them? So there's 2 types of souls called the seed of man and the seed of animal. This is from Yirmiyahu. What's the difference? The seed of man has introspective consciousness. In general, a man has introspective consciousness and an animal does not have introspective consciousness. So when we're talking about the seeds of man, the souls that are the level of the seeds of man versus the souls that are the level of the seeds of animal, it's a parable, obviously. They're all seeds of man, and it's a parable. And the parable refers to the idea that there's levels in the souls, and the higher level soul is called the seed of man because what distinguishes man is what we're emphasizing here. And the lower level of the soul is called the seed of an animal because we're talking about what distinguishes between an animal and a man in the different levels of the soul. It's used as a parable. So what distinguishes man is introspective consciousness, and what distinguishes an animal is that they don't have introspective consciousness in our context. So therefore, there are souls that have this conscious awareness and feeling of godliness, and there are souls that have an intellectual understanding of godliness, but they don't have that deep connection and awareness. So those are the two levels of the souls that we're referring to here. And the definition, the term that's being used in this section of the mimer is das. This concept of das is the third of the intellectual soul powers. And das is conscious awareness when the intellectual understanding becomes attached and fixed within the soul, as if one actually sees and feels godliness. So again, the definition is that when we understand something intellectually, but we bond with it so completely that we become attached to the idea and we actually sense the inner godliness of the idea. So it ceases to just be intellectual, it actually becomes experiential. That's the das. It's a conscious awareness. So there's the consciousness, which is like the understanding, and there's the awareness, which is the feeling, right? So that's where we sort of, that's why I think they chose that term to translate, in the translation, because it sort of embodies both the intellectual and the emotional intelligence, right? Are we okay here? Okay. Yes? I don't see too many faces, but hopefully. Okay, and then the next, good morning. And then the next section is really the section that we were sort of in the middle of at the end of last class. So I thought we should start at the beginning of it to read it inside, to see, just to review that part inside. But these are the first three sections. Are there any questions before we start unpacking the actual documents again? Okay. Okay, fine. So let's continue. So section 4. So the concept of das developed in its connection to Amunah. So not everybody reaches this very high level of, okay, maybe we're also just gonna review this part. But not, so here it talks again, not everybody reaches the level beyond seed of animal to reach the level of seed of man in its entirety, like in its consummate level. But nonetheless, even though that could be true, all of Bnei Yisrael are called believers and the descendants of believers. So that was like, we had gotten into a big discussion about this last week, this like part of the review. And this is so because Emunah is not always experienced internally, and so it doesn't always affect one's actual service. That's what it talked about in the very beginning, right? That our goal is to have our Emunah pervade our faculties. We don't want it just to stay on a super rational level, or even just on an emotional level, right? Rabbi Feller used to say, when people would say, I'm a good Jew in my heart, he would say, you have to be a good Jew in your heart and in your arms and in your legs and in your hands. Like, you have to be a good Jew everywhere, not just a good Jew in your, or I believe in God in my heart. You have to believe in God in your head and your hands and your feet and your everything, right? Your stomach, like it's like you don't want the blood of your heart to stay in your heart. You want the blood to circulate throughout your whole body. So we want our emunah, we want our faith to circulate in our whole body. Like that's our goal. So we all have emunah, we all have the raw ingredients of emunah. It's hardwired into our soul, but we want it to actually permeate us. And for that, we need help, because we're not all automatically on this level of the seed of man that senses godliness. Some people are, but most of us are not. So for the most of us who are not, well, like, how can we actualize that and sort of get that to happen? So this is why this is sort of like a manual of how to get that emunah to permeate us. So this is why the pasuk says, know the God of your father and serve him with a whole heart. That das, which is conscious awareness, impacts behavior. When a person can activate their das, which is the conscious awareness of godliness, that does impact our behavior. As the pasuk says, know the God of your father. The result is going to be you're going to serve him with a whole heart. You're going to wind up serving him if you get to this level of knowledge of really this conscious awareness. He understands godliness and then he sees godliness everywhere. This is an activation of das. Once a person, it ceases to merely be an intellectual thing. It also becomes an experiential thing, right? It's like it's like the difference between a person who knows that, I don't know, let's say there's somebody who, okay, I'll give you an example. There's somebody who we know whose child has a very bad reaction to gluten. So, and she feels like her whole family does better without it. But there's one child who is extremely reactive to gluten. So maybe a few of her children know that gluten's not so good for them, but like it doesn't have such a big impact. They eat it sometimes, not others, whatever. But then there's like one child who, from a very young age, he knew that gluten was bad for him, and he was very careful not to eat gluten because he knew he had an immediate bad reaction to it. So there's different levels of knowing, right? There's like knowing, sort of, believing. It's almost like a belief, like, oh yeah, that's probably not so good for me to do. But then there's the knowledge that's a real experience, and then that impacts behavior much more automatically. It doesn't even require as much of a struggle, because it's like, I know this is, I eat this and then I'm, wind up with terrible stomach pains. I'm just not going to eat it. But if I eat this and I maybe feel bloated the next day, or, put on a little weight in 3 weeks. So like, maybe that's not such an immediate thing. It doesn't impact me so much. I know it, but I don't always, it's like that. Right. So that comprehension gives rise to a love and awe of God, which is on a much higher level, that should be, than the natural occurring love and awe of Hashem. We talked about that a lot last week. Also, that idea of the meditation and the unifying with that idea gives birth to not only intellectual understanding but also emotional connection. So this is due to the fact that conscious awareness, which is similar to seeing with our mind's eye, affects us deeply. Just like when we see something, it affects us deeply, as the advertising agencies know, right? Like they put a lot of money into the advertising just so that a person can see something and then they can't live without it anymore, even if they 5 minutes ago didn't know it existed and didn't need it even in the slightest. But 5 minutes later, once they see it, they absolutely have to have it, right? So when we see something, it affects us. And when we see something with our mind's eye, which is a more spiritual seeing, it also affects us. We become attached to it. Like being awake, it seems, in the parable in the maamarim was talking about the difference between being awake and asleep, but both on an intellectual level and on an emotional one. That's what conscious awareness is. Conscious awareness is that we're understanding and it's sort of experiencing it or seeing it to the point where it affects us. Another term for that is gazing into, which is the Hebrew term is histakel, and it's compared to chachma, the first of the intellectual capacities of the soul, which is a very ephemeral type of capacity. And this brings about a change in a person. It has a lasting effect. We look into, like the Pirkei Avos says, you look into 3 things and you won't come to sin, right? It's like that person who, like, I know if I eat gluten, 5 minutes later I'm in terrible stomach pains. I know it at a different level than somebody who read a paper about how gluten causes everybody to have inflammation. I'm starting picking on gluten today. You could pick on any, fill in the blank, it doesn't matter. But whatever that point is, there's a difference between like knowing something and understanding it on an intellectual level, but it doesn't really affect me that much. so gazing into, which is histakel, is that thing that really like affects us. Understanding is similar to hearing. Conscious awareness is similar to seeing, but understanding is similar to hearing, and we won't feel as deeply about it. We can understand something without feeling as deeply about it. It's perhaps similar to being asleep. It's called contemplating versus gazing into, and it's compared to bina versus being compared to chachma. There doesn't have to be a lasting effect. The person is affected while they're contemplating these ideas, but not necessarily does it affect them like 10 minutes later, an hour later, a week later, whatever it is, right? So whenever somebody makes a life change based on something that they learned, working backwards, we say, oh, well, that must have affected them more deeply, that their das must have been activated at some level, because this didn't just last for the moment that they were hearing about it. They took action about what they had learned about. Does that make sense? This is where I think we like really got into a very beautiful practical discussion.
Hi, I just have a question.
Yeah.
It seems like to me, when you say understanding seems to be even deeper level than see. Well, when you think you understand something, it seems that it does touch your emotions because you're understanding, you're getting it. So it's a little confusing when understanding appears as a lower level than seeing.
Well, the seeing is not just a surface seeing. It's a seeing that comes from a conscious awareness. It's like really it's connecting to the idea in a person's it's like insight. Maybe that would be a better way of the terminology is, remember, we're using English terminology, the way that they translated it. It's not, but the idea is, think about maybe the idea of insight. Maybe that's a better way of hearing it. And the idea of understanding, it means that a person's understanding it, they could understand it on an intellectual level, but not connect with it. Like, think of that story of the ethics professor at Oxford, right? Yeah. And he compared it to the math professor, right? A person can understand an idea, but not it has no relationship to them. They don't have a relationship with the idea. They have an understanding of the idea. It's similar to, like, in another mimer, the Mitzvah talks about how, two people can hear and listen to the same, let's say, lecture, right? Or like you have in a classroom, two people can sit in the same classroom and hear the teacher or learn the material. And one person comes out and like they've been inspired by it and they're applying it to their life and it made a difference to them. And one person understands it, maybe gets 100 on the test, can tell you back the information, but they have no personal relationship to the information that they learned. That's really what we're trying to talk about. Does that address your question?
I guess it's just the order, like the order of you think that because understanding comes second, that you worked with the information and then made a relationship with it because it's coming second in the way that the body seems to grasp things. You're
raising an important point, Rachele, and that point is that when the two come together, that's the das. Meaning when you have, we're almost, in a certain way, the mimer is almost talking about Chachma itself as das, but then really explains that it's the connection between Chachma and Bina and das that is the real das.
Right.
So you're right. It's a little confusing at this point in the mimer because it looks like he's just saying Chachma, just Bina, but really ultimately it's going to be that the das. And the reason why is because we're talking about das first at a level that's above both Chachma and Bina. So you're already above both of them. And then we're saying, oh, but if you just do it on an intellectual level, it's just understanding. So Chachma here almost includes the das, that's the supernal das. And then you get to just
saying, how does it get above the understand? I mean, how do you get that higher level before you went through the other two levels?
Well, it's the higher level of the soul. It's the Kesser level of the soul. The Das Elyon is before Chachma and Bina. It's the inclusive super level of the surrounding level of the soul that allows for Chachma and Bina to join. It has to be higher than both of them. So there's the higher level of Das and the lower level of Das, which is going to be, I think, in the next section of the mimer. So
Uh-huh.
we're really almost talking about Kesser when we're Kesser as it feeds into Chachma when we're talking about the Chachma here. We're not talking about Chachma by itself or Bina by, and then we are talking about Bina
Okay.
by itself almost.
Yeah. Well,
Does that address your question?
yeah. So okay. So how does the Bina get to the? I mean, it's the Bina, the understanding that causes the emotion, gives birth to that emotion.
It's the
So
Chachma and Bina coming together that gives birth to the emotion. It's not Bina by itself. Remember, Chachma is like the father, Bina is like the mother. Even though the mother houses the baby, she can't house a baby without the father's contribution.
right. But
So,
yeah, okay. So the Bina by itself remains still an intellectual aspect. It didn't really give
right,
birth to
it has to
emotion.
be it has to be inseminated by Chachma.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, just sort of how it works.
Yeah, it's just the way this particular wording of this mimer is a little bit confusing at times.
Imagine Chesed and Chachma being sort of together when we're talking about the gazing into a little bit. That's what I think will help.
Say that again. Imagine what?
Imagine the Chesed and Chachma being together when we're talking about gazing into the
Okay.
Histalkos.
Okay. Right.
Okay, but I think Simcha had a question. I think Devar had a question.
No, it wasn't a question. It was just a comment from a few minutes back that we think of the word seeing as with eyes, but there's another meaning like I see your point.
Right, it's the mind's eye. That's what we're talking about.
Right,
Here.
but the mind's eye is what grasps somebody's point.
Right, exactly.
That's why we use that word.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right, it's the mind was similar to seeing. If you look at here, similar to seeing with the mind's eye. It's not a physical. Exactly what you're saying. It's not a physical thing. Simcha, did you have a question?
I was just wondering about like people who it seems like you had the DOS because, right, you said it makes like a big effect on you and it changes something in your life and it changes, but then often people will then slip back, you know, go backwards, I guess, and do things that they weren't because it made a big effect on them. Like, what is it considered then? Like you had DOS for a while and then slipped backwards, or that's just your, or maybe I'm not understanding it all, but it's just your personal, because you're a human being and you don't have the strength to go with what is actually that connection. Like, or did they never have the connection really and it was all just logical to them?
I mean, probably in each situation is slightly different, I would imagine, right? It's like, you know, and sometimes, you know, the connection of das tachton to the emotions and then the actions might not be complete, or sometimes there could be a new challenge that comes up and, you know, challenges that connection, or sometimes, you know, there's so many, you know, I think sometimes we can be really connected in one area, but in another area, you know, it's a loose wire. You know what I mean? It's like,
right.
It's like
so it could be any of them. And then my other question was, can you remind me, what did you say when you're sleeping? What is that? You gave an example of when you're asleep.
So it's an example in the mimer, like here, being asleep, that a person's doesn't necessarily feel the presence of their soul as strongly as when they're awake. That's what the mimer seems to be hinting at. He talks about being awake. So we would think that possibly being asleep is the opposite. So you don't sense your soul the same way you sense your soul when you're awake. So a conscious awareness, a person senses something, and then we compare it. When we were learning the mimer originally, we compared it to Levi Er, the Hasidic discourse we learned last summer, which talks about how the heart of every Jew is always awake, but their consciousness might, you know, their outer appearance might be asleep. I'm asleep, but my heart is awake. So like there's different levels of connection and awareness and activation, I guess we could say. Like that's where just, we just work on it. I don't know if that answer your
Yes,
question.
thank you.
Yeah, okay. Somebody else had something you want to say. Eliana, you wanted to say something?
What comes to mind for me are Balchuvas, and how much it really impacts their life. And some people become, jump into it up to their neck, and it lasts for 5 or 6 months, and then they're out again. And other people, it truly changes their life, and they don't go back to McDonald's. And so I just thought that might be a good example of when it really becomes Das, as opposed to never quite getting there.
Okay, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Okay, so are we, yes.
No,
I see, we got.
You'll never get out of here. Never.
We paused here last week and we're pausing here again.
Okay. Maybe there's something that has to be worked out. I agree with Rachel that hearing and seeing used in this mimer is the total flip of what I've learned about hearing and seeing. Because hearing I've always been taught is the finer sense than seeing. That hearing is a deeper sense than seeing. But the Rebbe is flipping it here, and I'm very confused actually about the terminology. And I think it's just terminology rather than concept.
Yeah, because let's address that a little bit again. The way that hearing is in general, the way that hearing or being whatever has more of the person's effort put into it, which is why I think, in general, we talk about that idea, right? Like, it's like the person's effort is put into it. And so it's always a lower level, but it's through their own effort, so it affects them. Whereas Chachma is a higher level, it's always a higher level. It's the first of the spheres, being a second of the spheres, and it's more like a lightning bolt that comes from above. But Chassidus is replete with the idea that, not just Chassidus, right? Ein doime shmiya l're'iyah is a quote, I think, from the Talmud. You can't compare hearing to seeing. Seeing affects a person more. I mean, think about news. Think about the difference between reading an article in the newspaper, which is what people used to do for years and years, and watching a newscast with pictures on it. I mean, unfortunately, we have so many examples. I mean, let's say what just happened in Surfside, right? Anybody who heard about it, it affected them. I'm sure it affected them deeply. And at the same time, anybody who saw videos of it, right? They know that seeing something affects a person, pulls at a person's heartstrings differently than just hearing about it does. That's just, the whole newscast, the whole news society is built on that. The whole advertising society is built around that. Unfortunately, we know from all the stuff going on in Eretz Yisrael, how they conveniently use videos of situations to promote the public to feel a certain way, and it's lies. I'm saying, I remember in high school, I remember my teacher showing me, and there wasn't internet then, and there wasn't all this. Now it's completely out of control. But a video, two news clips. I don't remember which news stations, it was about, but whatever. There was this picture of an Arab carrying his daughter down a hill. I can still see it, literally, I can still see it in my mind's eye. The limp daughter, whatever it was, because after something, I forgot what it was, that they were trying to show how cruel Israel was. And in a different clip, it began exactly the same way, but the clip went 20 seconds longer by mistake in one of the, and he's carrying her down the hill, and then all of a sudden she jumps out of his arms and she continues running down the rest of the way. Well, that's a completely different story. She wasn't hurt, she wasn't harmed. Maybe they were just playing on the hillside. It was maybe that clip had nothing even to do with what had just happened. Who knows where that clip had happened? They were playing. Right, but if you only saw the first clip and you had and the newscaster was saying something, so you had one impression, and that impression stays with us, right? Like I still remember that. I still remember, right? Or you had all this documentation, scientific documentation about, right, with Semmelweis, right? The whole idea of like the germ and, you know, how, I mean, that's like a very famous study, people can look it up, but like in 1 second, just a very short summary, right? It's like the germs, he was carrying germs from basically dead bodies to mothers who had just given birth. And eventually he only convinced his fellow doctors to wash their hands in between patients by showing slides. I think it was by showing slides of the bacteria on their hands. He talked about it and talked about it. He said he was a doctor at the highest rate of postpartum death with his women, and it came out that he was he was broken about it. It came out he was like literally going from dying patients to birthing women without washing his hands. The whole concept of washing hands in between patients is a pretty modern invention. So last, whatever, 120 years or whatever it was, it was at the end of the 1800s. I don't know, you look up the details. I don't remember all the details, but the idea was that he was trying to teach his colleagues, his students, to wash their hands. People didn't really get the idea until he like literally showed slides of before and after washing hands, right? Or like people were, so they could understand it, they could comprehend it, they could bring all sorts of studies, but until they saw and understood, it didn't affect action. You know, they saw the difference and then they understood it differently and then it affected them. So the idea of sight affecting us is, I mean, hearing also affects us, right? Any of our senses that are in our head, right? Chassidus talks about 4 senses actually: sight and hearing, smell, and speaking, actually, not taste, but speaking. Because anything that's in our skull, so to speak, goes directly to our brain. But here we're talking about the impact of our mind's eye. I just gave examples of physically sight, but we're talking about a deeper type of sight, like Dora mentioned, we're talking about insight here, right? Our mind's eye. But everything that's in the physical world is a parable for a spiritual understanding. So the way that we understand that seeing something affects us deeply, seeing something with our mind's eye, it's an intellectual seeing, also affects us deeply. And that's connected more to like the higher consciousness. That's what we're talking about. Does that help at all? Not really. You're holding judgment till the end of the review, and then you'll see if it helps.
I think so. Well, no, and only because, well, we don't say, see, O Israel, Hashem's whatever. We say, listen, Shema, hear.
And we cover our eyes, specifically because what we're covering our eyes when we say Shema, because we are specifically saying that we can't really see God's justice and God's hand in the world completely. We can't ever get to the level of complete sight. So we cover our eyes to tell us what you see in the world around you is not Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So don't let your lying eyes, tell you something. Close your eyes and understand it without your sight. Yes, because there's some things that we're not going to be able to understand. And what we actually see is not physically, is not something that we can, right? But we're talking about seeing with our mind's eye here. We're not really talking about physical sight. When we cover our eyes, we're literally covering our eyes to say that what we see in the world around us is not that Hashem is one. We see a multiplicity of creation. We see the physical world. We're covering that up so that we can understand that God is, that Havai is Elokeinu and Havai is one with the world, even though when we look at the world, we don't see it. That's a physical seeing that we're covering up.
All right, so I think the terminology, let's say insight, not sight, insight. There's a difference, Chaya.
Right, but the previous Rebbe says seeing with our mind's eye. That's how he puts it. So I want to use his terms as much as possible. I tried as much as possible in this review, which is no way that I succeeded. But I tried as much as possible to use the terminology of the mimer and I tried to stay out of it, except in our conversations, how I understand it, I'm going to explain it. Do I have a complete understanding of the mimer? Of course not. And I'm hope that I'm being true to what the previous Rebbe is teaching here. But I need to use his terminology to keep myself like on his path. So any mistakes, as they say, any mistakes in this review is my own, and anything that maybe is hard to understand, maybe I'm not summarizing it properly. But I do feel like I need to keep his terminology, which he says seeing with our mind's eye, which I would say also means insight, but I want to use his like terms.
Thank you. All right. Okay. Thank you, Chaya.
Okay. Joni and then Talia.
Yeah, so I just wanted to weigh in on, which touches us more deeply, hearing or seeing. And I just want to make a distinction between in the realm of hearing. So there's a difference between hearing a sound on the one hand, and on the other hand, hearing about it, like somebody's account of what, like a second person, hearing it from someone about that sound. So I'm just making a distinction between hearing about a sound and hearing the sound itself. That's all. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Yeah. And again, when we join Chachma and Bina, which is really the strongest model, then we get to Das, which is that conscious awareness. Remember, see, he's conscious awareness, he's defined as Das, and then he's saying it's seeing with our mind's eye, which I believe, and it's compared to Chachma. He does say it's compared to Chachma, but I believe what he means when he says it's compared to Chachma is the connection between the Keser and Chachma, the way that Keser feeds into Chachma. That would be my understanding of this. Talia?
Sorry to hold everyone up. I just have a question about sechel, like where that fits in, and in davening when you say lilmod, v'lelamed, lahashkil, these words, like I'd like to apply some of this to the davening, which I always kind of stop there, like lahashkil, lilmod, v'lelamed. Those are different levels of understanding to me. I don't know how they work with these terms.
Lahaskil comes from the word seichel. So those are not terms of specifically of Hasidus. Those are terms of the davening. Usually seichel, it depends on the context. Lahaskil or seichel can refer to the whole three components of Chachma, Bina, and Das. That's the seichel. The seichel is these three soul powers together, where they're working together, which is what we're trying to get them to do. We're trying to get them to work together. So usually after one has, but it depends on the context. Again, sometimes haskala, so in the positive way, lahaskil is to completely understand, and then you lahasais, and then you do it. That's even in the davening. In some contexts, the term haskala can have a negative connotation, which means that a person is only intellectualizing it, he's not applying it to his life. So you have to know the jargon, how it's being used. You have to define your terms in the context that they're being used. So it just depends. But like the Haskalah movement, for example, is describing a terminology is being used to describe a situation where people are merely intellectualizing, like the ethics professor. But the term seichel in general, like if one's going to be very specific about it and careful in the use of it, which, in davening or, as davening is explained through the eyes of Hasidus, seichel would include in general all three categories. The whole threesome of Chachma, Bina, Das is the seichel. It are the three soul powers of the seichel versus the seven, which are the emotional soul powers. So seichel and midos, it's divided by seichel and midos.
That's helpful.
The seichel is the three, and the midos are the seven. That's
helpful. And I was just thinking, like the difference between when you go from understanding to being able to teach. Lilmod v'lelamed, like you put this thing together. For me, that's such a huge amount of work to be able to put an outline together. You have to get to a point where you have it more internalized, and it's a long road. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your thank you. it helps me to learn it better too when I do this. So thank you for the opportunity. Okay, are we ready to go on to the next paragraph? Okay, no, we're not. Carolyn, do you have a question? Oh, no.
It's not a question. It seems as if seeing could easily, so when you see something, it could easily skip over going down from that point of seeing, skip over understanding, and goes right to the heart too.
Well,
Do
any
you
one
know
of the
what I
four
mean?
senses, any one of the
Yeah.
four senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, or speaking, has a direct route to the brain, which is why we have to be
Right.
careful with what we see, what we listen to, what we smell, and what we talk about,
But it
because
seems-
it has a direct impact on us. But
Right.
we are in the process now that we are not trying to short circuit anything. We're trying to go through all the channels to get to a complete service of Hashem. And we're not actually talking about physical seeing, we're talking about mind's insight. So it's a parable, but it's not, a parable, the analogy and the analog are not exactly identical. If they would be identical, they'd be the same thing. They wouldn't be two separate things, an analogy and an analog. It's an analogy to help us understand the impact that we want to be having. And at the same time, it's not a perfect analogy, which is why it's not the thing itself, right? One is a physical sense and one is an intellectual sense. But yes, any of those things can affect us. That's why we have halacha that says, be careful what you look at, be careful what you listen to, be careful what you smell. I mean, in the context of halacha, it's not allowed to smell the incense that's brought for idol worship. And be careful what you talk about, because all of these things can have they're in our head. Those senses are in our head already. That means they have a direct line to the brain, which means it has a direct line to affect us. So you're correct, 100%. All of these things can affect us. What we're talking about here is utilizing the natural structure of the soul, I guess, in a certain way, to be able to connect to Hashem at the best level that we can, I guess, is, each of us to develop, to try as hard as we can to actualize our Chachma, Bina, and Das. That's what our goal is here. But yes, people can be affected by all of them. You're absolutely correct.
But I was thinking how Chachma, if you see something, I mean, even physically see something, is more powerful, because if you're with a child and you see and you pass an accident, you immediately want to cover their eyes more than you would their hearing, because it's so much more powerful. So it's kind of on a higher level, because you know what I'm saying?
Well, that's why we're saying that conscious awareness is being compared to seeing with our mind's eye. That's exactly the point of the mimer. That's exactly the point. We're trying to get to that level where we have a conscious awareness, which is being compared to seeing with our mind's eye. Because sight does have a trauma, a lot of trauma that people experience is from what they've seen. You could hear about something, and it's not that that's not traumatic, but it's not as traumatic as seeing it. I mean, imagine somebody was standing in front of the World Trade Center when the planes exploded in them versus a person who didn't see any news pictures at all and they heard about it. It's a different experience. It's a completely different experience. Even if the person understood that there were 5,000 people who, think about seeing pictures from the Holocaust. Think about seeing the pictures of the when the Red Cross came in, America, whatever, people came in and liberated the camps. Looking at those pictures versus hearing about it.
Right.
There's no comparison. Right. So what we're trying to do is use that quality on a spiritual level for a positive thing. We on a physical level, we can also use it for a positive thing. On a physical level, that's one of the reasons why we hang pictures of tzaddikim in our homes. on a right, so that we can see the face of a tzaddik, because we want to see holy things. On a physical level, it's why we have what the Rebbe's talked about, this idea of having a house full of svarim, that people should see when they walk into a Jewish home. They should see, not only when other people walk into our homes, but when we walk into our own homes, we should see holy books and, you know, pictures of tzaddikim and things that are holy. That's what we should see. It talks about, you know, when a baby is born, you're supposed to hang a shir hamalos in their little bassinet or whatever it is, so that they see holy letters, right? We're trying to make it even in we talk about the concept of imprinting something in a person's consciousness. It's from what they see, right? So we try to use our physical sight to imprint in ourselves things that are holy. And then what we're trying to do now also is, on a spiritual level, use our mind's eye to see and imprint in ourselves ideas of godliness, so that those will affect us on a deeper level. And of course, we want to also unpack intellectually the understanding and everything else, for sure, because we want a full-bodied experience. We don't want it just to be, you know, lopsided in any way, right? We're trying to bring our whole selves into this experience. But when you talk about a conscious awareness or the ability to sense something, you're talking about every part of you, not just your sight, not just your hearing, not just, you're talking about your whole self. So that I think is what that's my understanding of what the previous Rebbe is trying to explain here. That's what he's trying to encourage people to develop in themselves as much as they can. And again, there are people who have this natural talent, you know, spiritual talent. You know, God gave it to them for the purpose of their soul's mission. The consummate person who had this was Moshe Rabbeinu, because his soul's mission was to give the Jewish people a Torah and set us on our path for all of history, right? And the tzaddikim and the leaders of the generations are given this ability so that they can guide us, the Moshe Rabbeinus of each generation. And then the rest of us are working at it. We're works in progress. Does that help? A little bit? Somewhat? So like, I didn't know this is what I signed up for when I came to this class. How are we doing? Better?
Yes. Lingo, current lingo. It used to be cool to say, I hear you, I hear you. Now we have to say, I see you, which is so awkward.
Well, or better, you have to say, I sense you. I sense this. I sense this. That's what we're trying to get here.
Thank you.
It's rough, Chaya, but you're doing good work.
Thank you. I'm trying.
It is. It's rough. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful mimer, but it's hard.
I'm right. It's astonishing to think that the previous Rebbe just came to Chicago and just said this mimer to everybody, and it's like, what did he expect everyone to understand? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
It's a great mimer.
Yeah. And thank you for all your work and helping us understand.
It helps me too, like I said. Like, the more you discuss it, the more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good review.
Okay. So should we go on to the next paragraph or what? Are we ready to do that? Okay. So this last paragraph of this section is additionally, it says that the Holy One, blessed be He, does not attach an evil thought to a deed. That's a quote. And the Holy One, blessed be He, attaches a positive thought to a good deed. This is not from Chassidus. I think it's also, I think it's from the Gemara. Hashem does not attach an evil thought to a deed. What does that mean? But for a good thought, on one level, what does it mean that he does attach a good thought to a deed? It means Hashem counts a good intention as if it's been done. So he attaches it to a good deed, it means like, oh, it's as if it has been done. On a deeper level, it refers to the idea that should a person think and desire with a whole heart to study Torah or to do a mitzvah or to develop a good character trait, right? Those are the three things we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to learn Torah, we're trying to do mitzvahs, and we're trying to develop good character traits, refine ourselves. Through Hashem will, through divine providence, bring about circumstances which allow that to happen. So he actually helps to attach a good thought, a good intention. It could be, you could translate it almost as a good intention, but it's a good machshava tova. It literally means a good thought. Like a person has a thought that he wants to do this, Hashem is going to help him to be able to do this. So that, I think, in this concept of das developed in a connection to Amunah, really, I don't know why it seems like this idea is coming in out of left field here a little bit. It's like, hello, what's going on all of a sudden? But perhaps we can say that why is the previous Rebbe putting this in here? Because probably a lot of people get stuck over here saying like, how can I ever do that? What does that mean? I want to do this. I wish I could do this. I don't even know what that's being accepted from me. I want to try to get to this understanding of conscious awareness of Hashem and everything else. So perhaps we could say that the previous Rebbe puts this idea in here to like sort of let us know that Hashem is going to help us do this. Like we might be feeling a little lost, or like this is a little bit difficult to accomplish, not even know where to begin necessarily, but Hashem is going to help us do this. Then in the fifth section of the Maimer, it talks about this idea of das's connection to Amunah, continued. Even though Hashem doesn't attach an evil thought to a deed, the trace of the thought still remains. In other words, person is thinking about doing something inappropriate, but through this avodah of histalkus, of gazing into, even the trace of the thought is removed. So the tshuva process, I guess you could even say, that Hashem is going to help us to accomplish this, and even if we've made mistakes, Hashem is going to help us to accomplish this. And then here's like really this main point that we've been trying to build in the whole Maimer is this avodah of histalkus, gazing into, right, which seems like it's the higher level of das and chachma kind of combined, is this food of faith that strengthens one's emunah. Remember, we said that we have to strengthen our emunah, right? We need to nourish our emunah. That's the very beginning of the Maimer in order to have it pervade us. So how do we, like, what is the food of the emunah? How do we nourish our emunah? How do we connect our emunah to ourselves? Is this gazing into is the food of faith that strengthens one's emunah, like physical food, which binds the soul and body together. What does that mean? When one senses the holiness in the letters of Torah and the divine concepts expressed in davening. That is, when we do that, that attaches our emunah to ourselves. Now, if you think about it, if it's correct to say that the histalkus that the previous Rebbe is talking about here is how Kester connects to Chachma, that is really this is like the definition of what's happening. What's happening is that we're bringing the emunah into our Chachma, which is we're bringing our surrounding soul power into our first permeating soul power, which means we're bringing it in, we're nourishing ourselves with our faith. This gazing into, sensing the holiness in the letters of Torah and davening is actually bringing that natural faith, which is a surrounding power, into our consciousness, and then from there into our understanding and into our ability to sense it. Like that's what's happening. So we want to do that. Like that's what we're trying to accomplish here. As mentioned above, Hashem says, I will sow the house of Israel with the seed of man and the seed of animal, representing the different levels of service of the souls. The seed of animal, intellectual understanding, which is hearing about. Seed of man, knowledge in the form of seeing. So he's reviewing that because now he's going to explain the two paragraphs of Shema, which are going to be each one talking about a different, the seed of man and the seed of animal is represented in each paragraph of Shema. So the first paragraph of Shema reflects a time when the Jews are carrying out God's will. When it says, you shall love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, which is the word ma'od. Ma'od is the letters of Adam. So that's like seed of man, right? Because it's the same word as Adam. That is the people awareness of God as if they actually see it, the level of consciousness that is called doing Hashem's will, since they connect so deeply to Hashem. Another way that we see that the first paragraph of Shema is talking about this higher level of the souls, is their desire for Hashem, which the term is ratzai, elicits a manifestation of Hashem's Ratzain, which means will, like they have a will to be connected and run towards God. That elicits a manifestation of Hashem's Ratzain and brings an emanation of Hashem's will on them and their portion of the world through the tzinor that is created. Ratzai, Ratzain, tzinor also have the same letters rearranged. So when a person has a desire to run towards God, they elicit Hashem's will on them, and that brings like a pipeline. A tzinor means a pipe. It brings a pipeline through which Hashem emanates his will on them and their portion of the world. This helps their perception of the world to be different. In other words, when we serve Hashem with all our might, which is like, this is a hard service, right? We'll use all our might to try to reach that level of Adam. Then we create this pipeline where Hashem responds, and it helps us to perceive the world to be different. This is the quote. This is like this is like my favorite quote of the Maimer. For them, the world is a bright place because they see the inner core of everything, its true essence. I mean, at that time, what we learned, this line. So this is a direct quote from the Maimer. I just feel like, I don't know, there's just something unbelievably exquisite about that line. So that the person who is sort of living at that level of consciousness, this is their experience. And I think we mentioned at the time, the previous Rebbe, to be able to say it, he must have experienced it. And his final mimer to the world was Basi Lagani until Mashiach comes. And he lived through the darkest time in modern Jewish history. I mean, maybe since the times of the Inquisition, right? Like there hasn't been anything as terrible for the Jews as the time period that he lived in, through the Tsar, communism, Nazi, Hitler. I mean, just like, so, and he's describing this person who serves Hashem at this level, their experience in the world as a bright place. The second paragraph of Shema reflects a time when Jews are not carrying out God's will, because the verse in the second paragraph of Shema is when it shall come to pass if you listen. Listening, again, being of the intellectual understanding. We understand Hashem, but it's not applied in the same way. Therefore, it says, you shall love God with all your heart and with all your soul, but it doesn't say with all your might. We're not reaching the level of Adam, ma'od, meaning Adam. We're reaching the level of the seed of animal. There's an intellectual understanding, which is not nothing. Ladies, it takes a lot to understand these ideas intellectually too. And we never say that we're just understanding something intellectually, because we're not studying mathematics. Right? So of course it affects us, but it's just not at that level of the seed of man. This is the level of the seed of animal versus the seed of man as above. Okay. Any questions about that? I mean, all of this is always affecting us, right? But we're talking about levels of affecting us. Okay. So I have a question for you. This is the last page of the summary. We probably could do it in 5 or 6 minutes if people want to finish now, or we need to, I mean, class is over. It's like 10:32 and then.
It's too fast. It's nice to let this sink in, and especially since we just talked the Shema, that's such a big thing. I feel like.
So then we'll need to continue.
That's just me.
We could, I mean, it could be too rushed. I don't know. It could be, we rushed through section 5 a little bit too. But
I mean, the Shema is such a big deal. It would be nice to just.
Okay. Well, maybe what we'll. Okay, we could.
But that's just me. That's just me.
I don't know if anybody else.
I'm new here.
I just don't know if people are tired of the review and want to sort of finish it and start something fresh next week. No, you're not tired of the review. Okay.
No,
Okay.
Not tired of the review, no.
Okay. So then we'll end here, I think, because it is the end of class, and then we can pick up next week.